Hello, everyone. Good to see everyone. Excuse the slightly delayed start. We're having some technical difficulties with getting the third panelist on board, but I think that's just a good reflection of the state of the world and the kinds of challenges we're being thrown at us each day. I think also attendees are still coming in. I think we'll just start the session as we had planned, and then I think our third speaker, Carlos, will join us any minute. Thank you so much for spending this Friday afternoon with us. We are super excited to have this session, and I'm super excited to have it because I think we're going to get such a cool background look into what Mærsk and Responsibly are doing on the side of integrating sustainability in mass procurement processes, and especially when it comes to, of course, to risk management. And that's why I think we have such a cool session here today. Maybe just a few kind of housekeeping points before we get started. First point is that as all of our webinars are, we are recording this session and then we are putting it up online on YouTube afterwards. So you can also send it to colleagues and watch it again if useful. We are also using the Q&A function and have a lot of time reserved for questions and discussions among us afterwards, because we really want to make these kind of sessions interactive and also useful for you. And especially because this is such a difficult kind of frontier topic, we really value the exchange. So please do use the Q&A function as we go along, as we go through this session. Now, I would also encourage you to actually write into the chat the organization, ideally your name and the organization and country where you're from, because I know at least on the sign-up sheet we had a lot of people also from different locations, and it would be great to see all of you. I just can also now confirm that Carlos, you're on the call as well. Welcome, and good to have you here.
Hello, everyone.
Super. Speakers here, you've already met Carlos, ESG Digital Transformation Manager at Mærsk. Then we're lucky to have Thomas here as well, from the co-founder and CEO at Responsibly. And then I'm Sven Beiersdorf. I'm a co-founder and partner at Nordic Sustainability, and I typically lead our more complex strategy services and procurement integration services. Really good to meet you all. Now, what we're going to touch on is that I will, after these opening remarks, just to give a little bit of a glimpse of what we see as the kind of the state of procurement integration, because we've just been able to do a really cool benchmark with one of our leading clients, where we interviewed and discussed with some of the leading companies globally on where they are on integrating sustainability. And then I'll hand over the mic to Carlos and Thomas to tell us more about the cool joint journey that they're on at Mærsk. And I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of that. And then, as I said, we have about 35 or so minutes probably for questions afterwards. So please get them ready, put them in the chat as you go through this, and we'll be touching on them together. Now, with that being said, I'll get started. Just a small intro for those of you who don't know us. We are Nordic Sustainability. We're a boutique sustainability strategy consultancy here in Copenhagen, but working with companies largely across Europe. We have kind of full suite of sustainability services, typically also because so many of the issues link together, right? When it comes to kind of environmental and social side, but also when it comes to strategy and procurement integration, decarbonisation and procurement integration. So we offer kind of these services across the board, and we are lucky to be working with many of the leading and ambitious companies, both here in the Nordics, but also across Europe. And try, of course, to connect sustainability to building more resilient businesses. That being said, context of that we see for procurement. So I think when we talk about these points individually, I think they're quite clear to us, but I think it's almost under discussed how much the role of procurement is being reshaped right now with what we see as demands towards it, right? And reshaping the role of procurement, both in terms of mandate, but also in terms of kind of role vis-a-vis the rest of the organization, right? The first one is, of course, the one I think that we're most aware of with kind of recent Iran, COVID, and other challenges, is the need for procurement to be helping to build a much more resilient supply chain, right? And of course, the fact of the matter is that climate and geopolitical shocks are already here. We do a lot of climate risk and transition risk analyses, and it's clear that companies have to start to gear their procurement to a more volatile supplier base and to be able to build and identify redundancies for when commodity prices change or geopolitical issues make supply less stable. Most companies currently don't have much visibility on their tier 2 plus risks, and that is of course something that procurement functions will have to manage in the future, where we really see that procurement has to build a bigger transparency capability across the supply chain. Second part is one of those fun boxes that I think that we see all the time, but that is also not getting quite the I think discussion that it really needs. I think there's a little bit of a kind of regulation fatigue also with the experience of CSRD and the omnibus, right? Where I think many companies kind of refuse to accept that a lot of regulation is actually still coming. So when it comes to global due diligence regulation, EUDR, of course, that's already here, incoming product regulation, where we just see that companies need so much more information about their supply chain and about the companies and goods that they procure from. Executive liability is rising here. And for most companies, that means they need to do a major update to the risk processes, which of course is also one of the things we're really going to be covering here today with Carlos and Thomas. And largely, I think most companies all companies that have any sort of physical products will find, of course, that procurement is the key enabler to actually realizing the decarbonization goals that we might have set as a company. The key to achieving those SBTi targets sits in the supply chain, and of course in the translation of those goals to the supplier base. And of course, with that as well, and talking about commercial and customer value. Scope 3 and product data is now becoming the competitive reality in many sectors that our clients operate in, right? Where that is simply something that is being asked by in tender process or B2B information, and it's simply something that is, the better data you can provide, the better, right? So supplier engagement must be geared up. Now, I think, as I've tried to already outline, the kind of future demands of procurement functions are to a level that current procurement functions aren't typically able to provide yet, right? And so when we look at giving diagnostics to our clients in different projects, we really try to help them understand that there's kind of a traditional view of looking at procurement, which is very much focused around compliance and best practice. But really, what we also need to keep in mind, while the first one is useful to understand our comparative setup compared to others, what is the future view that we're building towards, right? That is one of supply chain transparency, of actual risk management, of end-to-end integration of sustainability into procurement lifecycle, of robust product data, of emissions reductions, of human rights performance, of consequence incentive models, right? But the world where we are today is still very much on the left, where we have different degrees of kind of, somewhat patchy integration, typically in different procurement processes, right? So what we've done on this benchmark that I want to mention, and of course I can only give a small excerpt here of what we found there, where we've been able to, together with one of our clients, interview 10 leading multinationals in a bunch of hours of interviews, different participants of the organizations that we've interviewed. And we've tried to assess with them across a kind of a procurement operating model that we built, right? How mature are they really when we look at this kind of trajectory of where the companies need to develop them forwards? So we built a kind of analysis model that allows us to kind of take apart each of the elements of procurement integration and put kind of a maturity step onto that for the companies that you interviewed. And on the basis of that is the procurement model that I think will come quite natural to those of you who work with procurement. With that, of course, looks at the strategic frame. What is our strategy? What are the KPIs? The organization, governance, and performance. How's the strategy translated into roles, into governance, into performance, and KPIs? Underneath that, of course, the end-to-end procurement lifecycle, from category management, from sourcing integration to contracting to procure to pay, to supply performance management and engagement. And underneath that, what we call the enablers of data, tools, and systems, and people and capabilities. And what was interesting for us when we did that analysis across the kind of steps that we've also outlined is that really even these leading companies, right, leading global players, all of brands that you would know, right, they're very much kind of in that managed to optimized maturity place that we have that I think characterize where procurement is at right now. So the green bars kind of signify the spread of the maturity of the different companies that we benchmarked, because of course we're not able to give the detailed information, but we can see that there's much less of a spread on the ambition, on the procurement strategy, and the kind of targets we want to manage into the into the procurement organization. But then when it comes about the operationalization, there's a much bigger spread, and no one's really there yet operationally where we can say we're able to have the kind of structures that actually help us manage the risks or the decarbonization into our supplier base, right? And just highlighting some of the key findings we've had from this. Again, no company leads kind of end-to-end across the procurement cycle. Many companies that have done things here and there, but few have done an actually kind of more integrated, systematic integration across the entire procurement process. We see that most companies are still in that risk management space where they have kind of a code of conduct that they hand over to companies and say, like, we all agree you comply with this code of conduct, and we'll spot check with some audits, right? But they don't have the kind of wider risk management yet that will be required by incoming regulation, and that also some tools like Responsibly ideally will enable. In terms of performance and decarbonization, it's very clear for most of these companies that the kind of current approach of expressing goals and decarbonization demands doesn't actually create enough benefit in terms of decarbonization journeys if it's not also backed up by stronger consequence and incentive models, which is what many of these players are focusing on. And unsurprisingly, and also the focus of this call, most companies see that they need massive systems upgrades to be able to handle the kind of data that they expect to be having to handle in the future. Clear best practices, those companies that have started actually integrating sustainability across the life cycle, from category management to sourcing to, again, the performance management. Those that have clear resourcing and clear integration and collaboration with the operational procurement departments, because of course this is a big kind of change management exercise. And the real differentiator that most of them are working on is actual decision mechanics adjustments, so that sustainability is a real decision criteria, right? Whether it be standard weighting and sourcing decisions, whether it actually be kind of integrated decision making from supplier decarbonization initiatives. So those things that automatically make decisions that are both kind of more increased resilience and sustainability benefits, in addition to the typical procurement goals of quality, cost and performance. So if you want to find out more about that, let us know and just get in touch. Happy to shed more light on that and help you understand how you get that into across. But I think what's especially interesting for us is, of course, the risk management practice, and that's where I'd love to hand over to Carlos and Thomas to talk us through what Maersk is doing and how the collaboration with Responsibly is trying to address this problem. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Esben, and thank you everyone who joined. I'm really happy to share our journey. I believe, again, we have a very, very big ambition, and in particular around net zero agenda, no? And we have been very proactive communicating the same. Internally, we have similar agenda for what we call the ESG topics. So the CARB is just one of the initiatives, but we have similar commitments on waste management, similar commitments in anti-corruption, no? So the standard ESG topics. And we want to move beyond compliance to impact. And I believe this is one of the main challenges everyone that is trying to assess the supply chain is facing. No, we are like in a loop of, okay, we assess 5,000 suppliers, for example, in our case. Then there is a new M&A, and the next day there are another 6,000 new suppliers there to assess. So it's like an eternal loop of assessing just the compliance, and we can focus on closing the gaps, on building partnership with our suppliers to achieve together our Maersk ESG agenda. So that's why our digital transformation is focused on moving beyond compliance to impact, and this is what we are trying to drive with the Responsibly help. Yeah. So that is one. Then, of course, you just mentioned some of the best practices We are trying to follow some of those best practices, like embedding the ESG risks as part of the category strategy design, also as part of the performance. But again, I want to be very transparent. We are very mature in the card, but we are not in the same level in the other ESG topics. And I believe the main reason is because this massive need of assessments that never ends. No, it's like eternal loop that we complete something and then we need to go to the next. So digital capabilities are, at least for us, should be able to remove part of that burden and also accelerate the review first. Second, the quality of the assessment. No? So I don't know how other companies usually do this, but we, in the legacy ways of working, we send Excel questionnaires. And that was all. No? Then we review it, the answers from that supplier, and sometimes the supplier share a document. And then we read the document and we do some conclusions. But that is not scalable. Let's imagine doing that for 60,000 suppliers. So the quality of the assessment was also one of the challenges that was like somehow holding us to move beyond compliance. No, it's like the check is good, and then we found some gaps, but then we need to go and start with another supplier. So in our strategy, the digital capabilities, of course, are an enabler, but that is not the only thing. We are also working together with our procurement colleagues to embed ESG practices in the formal source to contract first. This is our first stage. And starting next year, we are going to jump to procure to pay. No? So we aim to cover source to pay. Right now, I believe we are closing the first stage. So you just show in that chart the maturity in P2P is not there yet. It's like a very early stages. Maybe source to contract, because everyone is trying to focus in assessing the supplier to avoid introducing the risk, is where we see more progress. So we are doing both things in parallels. Digital tools and capabilities are the enabler and also give us a lot of focus, no? Because with data we can decide where to act, but that is not enough. No? We need to work together with the procurement colleagues to embed ESG in the strategy design and then in the performance management too. So I believe we are like progressing very fast, and that is only possible because we solve the problem of the assessment at scale. No, so I know Thomas will share a little bit more in a moment. So digital capabilities are an enabler, change management directly with the procurement colleagues who engage with the supplier. And I believe the other big piece you mentioned that is this supplier fatigue. They are receiving a lot of asks from the customers, and every customer is sending a questionnaire that is maybe specific for their needs. So we also were looking for a solution to simplify and to improve the supplier experience, even giving them the opportunity to reuse all the questionnaire they already pre-filled, because usually we ask the same questions. If we focus on questionnaires based in regulations, the questions should be very similar. So we don't want the supplier to spend time filling just the questions for Møller if he already answered that for another customer. So multiple things in parallel is then data, processes, platform, of course, people, the most important piece, and finally the governance. No, so we are trying to cover those 5 pillars for every ESG topic, and we need a tech solution for that. Yeah, so I believe that covers the full strategy. Can we go to the next slide, please? Are you there? I can hear you. I don't know.
We're on the problem slide now.
You mean this one, the problem slide, or the
Okay, sorry.
value creation slide?
No, I am seeing like the map slide. Can we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I am still seeing the same. Let me open the presentation in my desktop so I can at least look. But can you hear me at least?
Yes.
We hear you fine. It seems like
No
we should
worries.
be on the map slide now, by the way, Carlos.
Yeah.
Okay. I am opening the presentation because I don't know which slides we are right now.
Still at the map slide. So
Okay.
you can just guide us through.
Yeah, but again, I believe I covered the topics on the map slide. We are again approaching this work stream, embedding the ESG in the source to contract processes, cleaning and manage data at scale, building the tech capabilities, creating awareness around this topic, engaging directly with the procurement colleagues, and finally enforcing some KPIs as part of the business as usual. No? So we have our KPIs in the monthly MPRs, in the annual report, all those things. So we are trying to move those 5 pillars at the same time, and the foundation is the enabler is tech. Yeah. So maybe you can continue. I am still in the maps.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Now we're on the long-term value creation slide.
Okay. So why again we need to do this, because we have our own commitments, but also our customers. No, so it's very clear we are not alone in this. Every time our customers are demanding more clarity, transparency on how are we choosing the suppliers, why are we choosing that supplier, and they have their own expectations. In multiple cases, in particular with bigger customers, they include the ESG assessment and the level of maturity around sustainability as part of the requirement to select us. So we have those two motivations. Our own agenda, of course, we want to drive a supply chain that delivers using responsible practices, but we also have the pressure, and I will like that pressure from our customers to deliver the same values. I believe right now there is a lot of things happening in the geopolitical space, and in some countries maybe people is changing the concept or something like that to avoid like being in the spot. But Maersk remains totally committed, and our customers that are really engaged, of course, they are demanding the same. So we are, of course, providing this in the procurement side, trying to choose the best supplier, not just from the business perspective, also from the ESG and sustainability perspective, and with that, like enabling that vision. So I believe it's very evident how we are generating the value. And as Sven, you mentioned, procurement colleagues is in the middle. No? So we are choosing the company that maybe is going to be there for that customer, delivering what they need for the next 2-3 years. So we need to be very sharp and smart when we choose them. And this is, I believe, a win-win. Of course, that is not the case in every situation. We have in local small countries small suppliers that are the only ones who can deliver the service. So in some cases, we need to engage with them and work together to close the gap. So it's not always like we can choose the best ESG player, because there are not good ESG players in that specific space. So that also covers how we monitor post-contract that dynamic. But again, we are in the journey. The emissions reporting, all the net zero agenda is our front runner. And then we have another commitments, of course, in 14 ESG topics. So I believe that completes my part of this section, Sven.
Yeah. Super.
Yeah.
Should we just then hand over to Thomas?
Yeah, let's go with Thomas.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carlos. And maybe just to kind of substantiate on what you said, Carlos. So when you guys came to us, it was basically with that scalability and complexity problem in mind, right? It was like, hey, we have 60,000, if not more, suppliers. We have people sitting in Mumbai actually manually reviewing a lot of this information coming in. We can't do it for 60,000. We can do it for maybe a couple of thousand max. And it's just the landscape keeps moving, right? There was CSRD, then there was CSDDD, then there was Omnibus, CBAM, now EU-FLR, and all of these kind of regulations. So the complexity was very big. And I think, that is the complexity that we have in supply chains, right? It's ultimately a scalability problem. Most companies today have many suppliers, right? It can feel like a lot if you have 100. It's a lot more if you have 100,000. And then for every one of those suppliers, every one of those companies or entities, you have a ton of complexity behind them, because you're not just assessing a company, you're assessing a company and maybe on their labor practices, or maybe on their deforestation practices, or maybe you're assessing cyber and these kind of things. So every effort you take just multiplies up in that way. Even if you need to spend 5 minutes per supplier, you're very quickly on multiple FTEs per year in a lot of workload. So that was kind of the problems that you guys came to us with back then, Carlos, before we started. And I think you were looking for how can we do this work without relying super heavily on questionnaires, because it just creates more work on the Mærsk front, it creates more work on the suppliers front, and we know how tricky it is. How can we make sure we have something that works at scale? How can we make sure that we have something that can grow with a very kind of developing environment from a legislative point of view, and where it's not just a one-off thing that we do, as you mentioned, in 1 year we do an assessment and then something happens and we don't know about it, but how can we actually continuously stay up to date? So that was the brief we got in the beginning of our discussions, Carlos, way back in the day. I don't know if you want to put a few more words on it.
Map, so I don't know with the slide we are showing, but
We're still on the problem slide.
yes, okay. So the amount of time we need to do per each assessment, of course, was a challenge. Again, remember 2 years ago we were doing Excel reviews, so the level of detail was very basic. So we wanted not just to do a quick assessment, but also to do a deep dive. Yeah. And I believe the main thing I like it back in time is, can we achieve this without asking the supplier? Is there a way to get that information? And of course, this is what we learned when we tested the Responsibly, that they can check websites, public information, news outlets, and build like a full digital twin of that supplier, and then in match with our risk parameters, provide some sort of a quick full review. No, so it is taking, I believe, 1 week, Thomas, to complete the analysis. But of course, it makes totally sense, and it's even shorter than asking the supplier. Some of you that are joining the webinar, when we send the questionnaire, maybe the supplier never answers, or maybe answer one question. No. So in our case, we achieved to reduce that waiting time. Before it was in average 6 weeks. And then the outcome was some sort of Excel answers and 2 PDFs. Now we wait 5 days, and it's very possible that we get a full analysis, including the emissions data and certificates and all that stuff. So of course, the quality was very important. But I believe the main piece, Sven, is where we focus. No, so imagine we have this big amount of suppliers with different levels of answers, our human team reviewing and trying to get the sense of the maturity, and then we enter the same loop. So with these 5 days, we can quickly understand what is the next step. So we said, yes, we want to engage with the supplier, or hey, the supplier is not perfect, but it is progressing, is mature somehow. So let's put it in our second bucket, we call the medium risk supplier, and we just can focus. And then we are using industry and country risk. So it's like a 3 lenses to focus: the supplier maturity, the industry risk, and the country risk. With that, we compare with our internal plan. So we said, hey guys, we want to deliver this in Nigeria, for example, or on Netherlands. So we contrast that expectation, like, hey, we need to deliver this service, with the suppliers available in that country. And this is what we are trying to do right now. It's like, hey, procurement colleagues, you listed these 10 suppliers, good. Those are able to deliver the service, but 3 of them are very high risk. Instead of working with them, let's work with the medium or low ones. So it's focus, and that is only possible because we don't need to spend time doing the assessment, no, at least not done as before. And you see that number in the screen, 4 reviewers. So imagine 4 guys reviewing thousands of assessments, and then it's just one supplier plus 90 questions, plus maybe 20 documents in other languages, no? So a lot of tasks just to realize the maturity of that supplier. So these were our pains. Now we still have pains, but are different. No, I believe we achieve to have the full picture, and now we can cherry pick somehow. Hey, let's focus in this country. Let's try to progress in this country, and that at the same time or in sync with the category strategy, because we have our business goals. So we want to grow in particular countries. We want to deliver a particular new product. So that was the problem at that time, Sven.
Super.
Thanks, Carlos. If we go to the next slide, yeah. So this is where it quickly sounds a little bit scary when we talk about AI, right? But let's try to boil down the problem again. We're ultimately trying to solve this scalability problem. How do I get all of this variety of information so I can make the decisions I need to make on my suppliers? Now, what Responsibly does is we do due diligence, and we leverage AI and agents to do that. But the fundamental reason for that is that ultimately we want to automate a type of work that a consultant or a human would be able to do. And that's exactly where AI kind of fits in. So it boils down into these three different levels. The first is what we call agentic supplier research, and it starts even earlier than having to look at their website and all of these things. It even starts at the fact that it's going to be your procurement managers that are creating these suppliers decentrally in a system, right? And that's typically where the problem starts. Who is the company? What are they called? What's the data governance around getting that into the system? How do I have the right metadata so I can even do the risk analysis that Carlos talked about, where we're looking at what's the materiality and riskiness of buying from different countries and different products and those kind of things. So it starts all the way at that angle. Then it goes into saying, well, okay, now we have a supplier. We know how materially risky they are based on the context they're operating in. What are they doing about it, right? Have they taken action on, let's say, emissions? Are they disclosing emissions? Have they set targets to reduce those emissions, etc.? And that's again where what would a human do? Well, a human would start going through some of that supplier's communication, right? Are they publishing any reports? Are they publishing everything on their website, for example? What about if we look them up into these kind of third-party databases like SBTI or CDP or the different ISOs? And there's more than 1,000 of them, right? But what can we find from this? Is the supplier taking action already to mitigate some of these risks? And then there's the negative side of things as well, of course. So have they been sanctioned? Have they been given a penalty? What about the news space? Have there been discussion about that supplier in the context of violations and these kind of things, right? And all of that is something that was very hard to do before AI was invented and we could do this agentically, simply because a lot of this data is unstructured, it's messy, it's made for humans to read and not for machines, right? But now that we have AI, we can take the raw inputs that your procurement managers are able to create day to day, and then we can turn it into a very accurate and thorough due diligence on every single one of those suppliers, where we're able to go across standards, we're able to go across the information that the supplier is publishing and different other third parties are publishing to really kind of create a digital twin around that supplier. And once we have a digital representation of that supplier, we can start working with that more. And that's then the next step where we call it agentic data analysis. Because now, you can imagine just kind of the old-fashioned way of doing things. You collect questionnaire responses from 10,000 suppliers. Well, now you have a lot of information. So now you need to analyze that, right? And that's again where AI can really help you. How do we convert all of this information from a policy or a news event or a sanction? And how do we convert it into an insight? How do we take it all the way back to, for example, child labor or deforestation or that specific topic you're monitoring from a legislative point of view and say, was this good or bad for this topic? How can we create a rating around this supplier on that topic, etc. So we use these AI technologies again to dissect the information coming in, to analyze it, to convert it into something meaningful that you can take decisions on. So scoring, mitigation, checklist, KPIs, and all of these different things. So that's the second leg of that. And the third leg is then the feedback loop, right? To saying, okay, now you've derived at an output. You now almost instantly for every single supplier can get an understanding of where they are and what they've done in the past. How do you take action on that? How can you start working with that supplier to improve? Not to ask questions that you already know the answer to, but to basically say, hey, you have a lot of incidents here around child labor. Maybe let's work on some of the corrective actions to start improving those, or let's start capability building, or these kind of things. So we have a lot of mechanisms on that side of things to basically make supplier engagement easier for the supplier and for your buyers. And then in terms, make sure that when the information comes in, that gets processed again automatically using AI as well. So that's the whole point, right? Really kind of creating a system that's founded in AI, because that's what makes it scalable. So you can make sure you can really navigate the complexity across all of the legislations and all of the topics, and the scale that you need, so you can get a hold of the long tail of the supply chain, and you're not forced to focus on the top 200 of your spend, for example. So that's responsibly in a nutshell. And Sven, if you go to the next slide, then maybe Carlos and I will try to talk through a little bit some of the implications. What did this unlock for Maersk? Carlos, do you want to start maybe?
Yes. So the number you're seeing on the screen is the suppliers we completed the analysis already. We are going to embed more. And again, this is just tier one. No, the vision is we can go soon and also cover the next layers. So again, this is a very impressive number, and it's impossible to manage without tech. There is no way. And again, quality assessed. I think that is the main difference. So it's because of this that now we have a full baseline visibility. And we know also in those cases that we buy a new company and we complete a new merger and acquisition, then we will have the visibility of the risk that is coming even before finalizing closing that business. So it's not just assessing our incumbent suppliers, it's also how we avoid introducing new risk. And that loop is very important. And we can do that maybe one by one, maybe 20 suppliers, but we can do also for 10,000 suppliers in one shot. So that is fantastic. And then the second one, I already mentioned, getting data, not just in emissions, but in any ESG topic without needing asking to the supplier, for me, is impressive, no? So we replace that loop of sending Excel files with an initial analysis that is automated. The data assurance process is solid, so we can move to the next decision. So I believe this is what we call moving beyond compliance to impact, no? Because we are not starting in the gathering of the information, we are starting with the information in the screen. So for us, it's very easy to define what are the next steps. I also mentioned the key piece about the change management. That is still a challenge, but we are starting to embed the information, the conclusions we get from Responsibly as part of the procurement category strategy design. No? So that is very important. And in the long term, that is what we are looking for. That is what is going to create the impact, no? Because through the categories where we're going to say, okay, let's focus in this set of suppliers that are already compliant, are maybe mature in some of the ESG topics, and are aligned with our own purposes in ESG.
Fantastic.
And I believe, Thomas, if you want to share the last two, this is a lot of the technology. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's maybe just to kind of give a few nuances, right? So number one, you guys are using it both in kind of the management of the overall supplier pool. So that's how we're talking about big numbers like 60,000, right? Providing the visibility of where are there risks, where are there incidents, where are there mitigative actions already taken by the suppliers, and so on, right? And then we can get super specific, and you guys are a big organization, right? So you have different kind of internal teams tackling different topics. So a decarbonisation team would know then, where can we actually start using supplier-specific emissions to calculate scope 3. An anti-corruption team would look more about the corruption practices, diversity team on the diversity practices, and these kind of things. And of course, it also structures category-wise, and it also structures regionally, right? But a big advantage in just being able to make sure you have a foundation where you have the information, and then you can start, as you guys are now, working through that information and really kind of structure it in the different teams and the next steps and the implementation and those kind of things.
Thomas,
And I think
I'm just conscious about kind of time, and maybe it's a good time that we would open up to. I know you also have some of the kind of learnings of what still falls short, but I don't know if you want to maybe just summarize it briefly, and then we could get to some of the questions that also start popping up.
Sure, we can have a quick summary of that, Sven. So basically, I think point number one here, and I think Carlos, you agree very much with that, right? One thing is technology, another thing is then enabling it and adopting it in all of the internal processes, right? Technology is only as good as it being used at the end of the day, right? So given that there's a big procurement team behind the scenes, then that means that there's a lot of kind of transformation work going on to really kind of make sure that this technology and information and these kind of things gets adopted. And then, at the end of the day, engagement and audits are still needed, right? The due diligence process is a process, right? It doesn't exclude engagement. I think that's a very important part of the process. The key is how do we make that engagement and how do we make that audit process smart? So we don't waste it on all of the things that we can very easily find out. We don't waste it on lower risk suppliers, but we can really focus on where it matters. And then there's a few other kind of nuances here, right? But I think once we have that foundation in place, which we do now at Mærsk, then we are looking more into next steps and enablement and impact, as you say, Carlos.
Super. Thanks so much for the summary. I'm just eager to get to some of the questions, and everyone on the call, feel free to add further ones. I think one of the questions, and maybe afterwards we'll get back to the data, was about, how do you actually, I think it relates to the first, change management part here, right? It's impossible to manage risks across 60,000 suppliers. And you mentioned a little bit your process around how you then kind of extracting materiality and deciding what to focus on. But can you say a little bit more about how you think about that? How does it also relate to your kind of responsibility to manage risks of first tier suppliers versus higher up tiers, which probably aren't so visible in this tool yet, right? How do you think about that at Mærsk currently? Because I think that's a challenge that many that are also looking at triple D, of course, struggle with.
Yeah. So first thing is, Sven, and people, we have a solid governance structure. So each of the ELT members, like the C-level, they own the responsibility to deliver one of the ESG priorities. So that is one. We are anchoring our vision in ESG directly in the leaders. That's first. Then we have what we call the ESG topic owners. So we identify 14 topics from labor rights to data privacy to waste management. So in the 3 pillars. So we have one leader, global leader, who owns each particular topic. So it's a very solid governance. So that is the first thing, is we are starting from the leadership team and we are committing to deliver this. Second, of course, to be able to focus, we use double materiality assessment. So we renew it every 2 years. We do a human rights assessment. Yeah. We have an internal audits that are also monitoring particular cases. And of course, following the incidents that happen in our supply chain, we also identify where we have some challenges. So these 2 things, in particular, the human rights assessment and the double materiality assessment, quickly help us to focus, because we can do everything at the same time. And we have our ESG Mærsk sustainability strategy. So we have our own vision. So that is the frame we use to focus at a strategic level. That automatically means we can segment somehow our database, because not all the material topics are facing the same challenges. So we can say, okay, we are going to start with third-party labor, for example. We deliver a lot of our service to third-party workforce. So this is one of our top priorities, how we also make sure our suppliers' employees also deliver our Mærsk standards. That is defined maybe not every week, every month, of course. So we are doing a review every 2 years. And then that is the foundation. On top of that, we are crossing the data that is coming from Responsibly. So that is a specific risk based in country, industry, and the supplier specifically. And then we cross both things. So we said third-party labor is one of our priority topics for the next years. let's evaluate third-party practices in our supply chain, and then we focus on the high risk. So in that way, we can segment the supply chain, and then we can say, okay, we are going to work with these 300 suppliers that are facing a lot of gaps or are introducing a lot of gaps in our supply chain in third-party labor. So this is how we are doing, and every 3 years we review. We do like another assessment. It's like, hey, we have been working in third-party labor for the last 2 years. Can we move to the next topic?
And just understand, is that then with the 300 are still first-tier suppliers, right? Or
Yes.
most likely. So the kind of second tier and above, you're probably not interacting with yet, right?
Not yet. And that's why the other strategy is to work directly with the category managers to avoid introducing more risk. No, so it's like we already have 60,000 incumbent suppliers. We know where to focus, but we also need to close the other door. It's like, hey, we don't want to introduce more risk. And is there where the category managers make the decision, they choose the supplier, the sourcing managers, and hopefully then we have like a circle, no, like a virtuoso circle. So we said, circle, we are mitigating the risk in the risky suppliers in the material topics, and we are also avoiding introducing new risk from the other side. No, but again, we're in that journey. It's not like we already solved everything, and 14 topics is not just one thing. So, for example, waste management and water management for us, for Møllers in particular, for our specific products and services, is very, very important, and that is not easy to manage because we move a lot of vessels and containers. But I hope that answered the question. This is how we focus.
And I'm sure there's 15 sub questions we could still elaborate on, but I will leave this one here. I think there's a question to you, Thomas. What kind of key data sources are you using? And I would love to actually add to that a question of, as you also know, right, a lot of the data we see out there right now on, for example, the 5,000 emissions data that your company's emissions data that you already have, right? We know that's going to improve a lot, but there's also a bunch of information out there or not yet out there that will be crucial to decision making, right? Better audit information, actually human rights performance information that's in this kind of, a deeper auditing process, also product related information. So how do you think also kind of where, as you're developing your tool further, about where's the data already good? And what do you expect things to still massively change maybe so that companies can also think about what the kind of future look like, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important to also understand at the end of the day is that we're doing due diligence, right? Due diligence is a process, and by definition, it's about being thorough, right? And that means that the response on what data do we check is extremely long. Because the goal is, if there is a piece of negative or positive data, you need to not care about the standard, right? You need to be able to interpret and pick it up, right? So it means it's supplier communication, right? So it could be anything from a report to a website, stuff like that. It means it's the news space, which is the third leg of governance, right? Making sure that we can pick it up when investigative journalists find something out or when local things are happening. It means it's what we call third-party data. So that's the ability to navigate anything from a third-party resource like a government issuing sanctions or penalties or lawsuits, or the good side of things where it's certificates or SBTI results. It will also be audits and those kind of things, right? And then it's the inherent risk related to operating in certain places, right? Are you in a certain part of China that's more risky than others? And also maybe there's a strike going on right there, and all of these things, right? So that's kind of the due diligence process, so to say. Now we can keep adding on nuances, right? Are we analyzing the company, or are we analyzing the site, or are we analyzing the product, right? And also, do we also care about what's going on around where that supply is located, or are we just analyzing the specific business? It is imperfect by, almost design. That's how the due diligence process is, but it's extremely thorough. So we're able to kind of get to the focus areas where we can work more directly with the supplier. But we need to be super careful about that, because whenever we introduce a demand to the supplier, we create work, right? So we want to be absolutely sure that it's not like a nice to have because somebody's feeling insecure and just want to send out questionnaires, but it's an absolute must have. And then you need to start collecting more primary data, so to say.
So in a way, it's a really good kind of filtering tool for where to focus and do the first draft of the audit, and then you'll need to build on that with the teams and the engagement in certain selected
Yeah, exactly. But it's also like negative performance, right? Like when you have issues, do you actually know if you have a long tail of 10,000 suppliers that there were child labor violations over there and there were health and safety incidents over there and so on? And did you actually know whether or not those got addressed? And when you then finally do an audit, you get a 100-page document. Are you actually reading that? Do you have the capacity to go through it and take action on it and these kind of things, right? And that's also where we go in and help, right? So it's partly, without touching the supplier, making sure that you do your due diligence, right? And you look for the information, both positive and negative, that will allow you to prioritize. But then it's also when you actually are in the next leg of the journey and you're working with that supplier and you're maybe doing audits and so on to make sure that you have the tools to actually understand that information at scale. Because otherwise, we see a lot of companies where it ends up on a shelf collecting dust somewhere and it never gets leveraged, right? And that's almost sadder because now you've invested resources from the supplier in getting this information and you're not putting it to use either.
I think that's a very standard problem that we see across the board still as well. So
Exactly.
yes, cool. There was a question here from Anna about what do you do when you have a spend category, such as, for example, trucking, where you have a lot of different vendors that kind of collectively make a big spend. But of course, there are a lot of small vendors, so they're quite difficult to assess. There's probably not a lot of information even available. I think there's probably analogies to other procurement categories where the companies just are not very public or don't have much of a reporting, right? What do you do with those?
Good. So that is the standard, the average size of suppliers in trucking category. So we need to assess thousands of small trucking suppliers. I believe first we understand the inherent risk, so we don't go directly and engage with those. We check, oh, are you going to deliver this in the Netherlands? Maybe you are very smaller, but the inherent risk is not so big. In the other side, sorry, we have this like double risk. No, it's risky country, risky industry, and we don't know anything about that supplier. So that is the worst case scenario because we still need to deliver the customer the product in containers, and then we don't know anything about the supplier. So in those cases, I believe with Responsibly, we are getting the information around that supplier, and then we use the engagement model. So we ask questions. Yeah. We expect, and that is normal because they are very small companies, they don't even know anything about ESG or sustainability. In some cases, they just deliver the container, and these are truckers that are very good moving these things. But then you ask something about sustainability, and they say, "Guys, what is this? I just can't move this from here to the other corner." And in some countries, that type of supplier is a big spend because they are the only one. So we also have that restriction that there is not a lot of suppliers available to deliver the service. That happens in particular in the last mile. So this is a new product we are trying to introduce. And then we are facing this challenge. So there is a lot of offer, but the ESG readiness or the sustainability maturity is very poor. No. So inherent risk first. Then we mix this with the double material analysis. So we already have the material topics where we want to focus. And then we need to engage. So in those cases, the only way to get the information is to engage directly with them. And I believe, Thomas, if you want to share how you also try to simplify that experience, because even in some cases, those are small, it can be happen that they already answered these questions to other customer. So ideally, they should be able to reuse. But this is one of the features, maybe, Thomas, you want to mention about the supplier experience.
Yeah, absolutely, Carlos. And it's really, you said it in the beginning because it already starts at saying, hey, we have a trucking supplier. Well, first of all, when you want to move to engaging them, do you actually know what you need to engage them on, or do you apply the same engagement that you do to all other suppliers, right? So in trucking, we have issues like around safety, we have issues around working hours and these kind of things, right? So that's where kind of just materiality of making sure that you have the right level of analysis already just on the industry and country level, where that's trucking suppliers operating on, that will help you already start narrowing down, what do you need to assess them on. Then comes the assessment process, even also before engaging, where we know, hey, has this trucking supplier been involved in violations before? There's a lot of trucking suppliers where there's violations around them, and also in the news space, also for SMEs, because it is a quite risky business, and there's a lot of trade journals covering that business as well, right? So do you actually know that? Because that can also help you focus and narrow down. And what about, from a, certification angle and so on? Some of your suppliers may be more mature than others. And then when it comes to the questionnaire, as Carla said, and you have that kind of dynamically tailored questionnaire that's focused, well, this is not the first time the supplier is submitting a questionnaire, right? In most cases, they will have other customers that are asking this type of information. So you can give them tools where they can use AI to dig into the questionnaires they've submitted elsewhere, draft up responses to your specific questionnaire as well, which reduces the effort massively, right? So that's then the last part of the game. When you actually are engaging them on the right things, how can you make it very easy for that supplier to comply with and reuse existing information? So that's another kind of area where we think quite a lot about making it easier for the supplier.
Super. I'm just thinking, I'm just looking at the clock. We're almost on the hour. I don't know if there's a last question that anybody would like to put in the Q&A. I think otherwise you're also welcome probably to reach out to either any of us if you have further questions afterwards. Thank you so much everybody for joining this session. Thanks Carlos and Thomas for guiding us through the awesome work you're doing together. I'm sure that this is a long implementation journey for Maersk, and I think for the entire industry. And I'm pretty excited to see where all this is going and where tech can help, just like you're doing with Responsibly. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the warm weather wherever you're sitting. I think here it seems to have at least affected the bandwidth of image transportation towards you, Carlos. And have a good drink. Enjoy the weekend, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Great weekend, everyone.
Enjoy the weekend. Bye bye.